The polls that were done on the combined authority mayoralties were more or less in the right space. They picked the right winner in the two that Reform won and so on. So at this point, we can't say that this is a kind of polling phantom. This is real. They have got enough support to win and win consistently in a fragmented context. And then final point, well, who should be most worried about that? Although we are obviously seeing an awful lot of discourse from the Labour government about, oh my God, reform's coming to eat our lunch. Well, maybe they will eventually, but before they eat Labour's lunch, they're going to eat the Tories' breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I mean, these results would be, if repeated in a general election, would be an existential crisis for reform. There was a party called Reform in Canada in 1993 that completely wiped out the incumbent Conservative Party. Ailsa's smiling. I think she knows this story. Um, and I think Farage has cited that party as one reason that this is now called Reform UK. These are the kinds of results that look like that kind of replacement on the right may well be coming.
So if we look at the profile of people who say that they would vote reform in the next UK general election or have voted reform in the most recent one, then we know that they are far more likely to describe themselves as English rather than British. They are far more likely to believe that England gets less than its fair share of resources, far more likely to believe that Scotland and Wales get far more access to resources than they should. We haven't quite moved on from Brexit because although reform voters are less likely to cite sorting out our relationship with the EU as one of the main problems that warrants attention, Labour voters are much more likely to mention that. They are the portion of the electorate that's much more likely to say that we haven't got Brexit right, that our relationship with the European Union is still too close. So in a way, the introduction of Brexit has not satisfied demand for Brexit among this portion of the English electorate. And then there's also layered on top of that attitudes to immigration, as you mentioned, but also distinct attitudes towards English governance. So they are the most likely to support English independence. Numbers are not high, they're not at Scottish levels, but they're touching Welsh levels of support for English for independence among reform supporters. They're most likely to say that they want an English parliament and they want an England-wide solution for English governance problems. So what we have here is a portion of the electorate that feels that the union is not working well for them at the moment. They think that other people have more access to resources and influence than they have. And I think what you're tapping into there is a legitimate concern about the way English governance has reacted to the introduction of devolution in other parts of the UK.
There is a coherence to a large section of the reform vote, which can be traced all the way back to the early UKIP years. But it is a coherence on one of what we might call the sort of two fault lines of politics today, the two dimensions of division. You've got an economic dividing line in terms of free markets versus the state, redistribution versus letting people keep their money, etc., etc. And then you've got a social values divide, which is nowadays you're talking about things like woke, but it's also immigration, national identity, attitudes to social change more generally. Reform are very coherent on that second dimension. They are the people who, like William F. Buckley, want to stand athwart history and yell stop. They don't want immigration. They don't want social change. They want to go back to traditional values. They believe in traditional identities and all this kind of stuff. And you plug in any of those kind of measures into your little statistical model and it'll come out as a strong predictor of being a reform voter. So they are very coherent in that space, but they're very incoherent in the other space in terms of economic values. There was a really nice report recently done on the reform curious amongst Labour voters who obviously like of considerable interest to the governing party at the moment, and they tend to be quite left wing on public sector stuff. They basically want the public sector to work better and they want to spend more money on it. Whereas the core reform voters are the opposite. They're often quite free markety, and you also see this in terms of the reform activists and politicians. They tend to be often quite Thatcherite Tories of origin, whereas the average reform voter is often they're often people who are like, I wish the state would work, but I don't think it does. So they would be in favour of spending more money on the state if they thought it would work. But they're definitely not ideologically small state or anything like that, which actually puts them at odds with the politicians that they're electing. So this is one of the interesting questions for reform going forward. Now they're a big player. Now they're potentially going to be talked about as, a party of opposition, a potential party of government. That inconsistency, that fault line on one of the major, divisions in terms of what government should do and how it should do it, will that get exposed? Will that get scrutinised? And what impact will that start to have on their support if it is? One of the things, this is a nice venue actually for making this comparison, to just be a bit provocative. I like to say that Farage, possibly the politician who has the most in common in terms of their, long apprenticeship in politics with Farage, is someone like Nicola Sturgeon. Both Farage and Sturgeon had to spend long, long years pounding pavements in obscurity, making arguments to people who didn't necessarily want to hear them. It's made them very effective, very polished, very persuasive, very good at like gut instinct sensing where they can and can't go, where they can be specific and where they can be vague. He's very good at all this kind of dodging and weaving stuff. So he'll be fine. He will keep bailing out of these discussions with, a cheeky grin and so on, and it'll be fine for him. The problem is it's no longer just a one-man band. I mean, they already lost an MP. It didn't even take them a year. And now they've got these hundreds and hundreds of councillors. They've got council leaders. You've got Andrea Jenkins as an elected mayor. You've got the Boxer guy as an elected mayor. So there were going to be other people spouting off, lots of them, and getting cameras in front of them in order to spout off. That becomes more difficult. My suspicion is what we will see is more people getting chucked out. That basically Farage will think, and not without reason, ultimately what people are voting for is me. They aren't voting for these other people. So if these people are becoming a liability, off they go. No one is as important for this as the driver of the bus, which is Farage. So here you go. Here's a prediction. Always a dangerous business to make predictions in politics, but my prediction is we will be seeing quite a few of these councillors and maybe even some higher profile figures getting chucked out before we get to the next year's local and devolved elections.
The SNP has lost about a quarter of its support since 2021, 48% now to, on average, sort of 35, 36%. So it's lost a significant amount of its support, but will probably only lose, if the election were now, et cetera, and the polls were correct, would probably only lose 7 or 8 seats and would be still by far the largest party, even if sort of 10 or so seats short of a majority. But yeah, I mean, I think, of course, the First Minister is entirely aware of all this. Reform, just like in England, reform support is coming pretty much entirely from a mixture of Labour and Conservative voters. Still more Conservative voters than Labour in Scotland, and hardly any at all coming from the SNP. So if you look at kind of constitutional preferences now on the no side or the unionist side, Reform is now the most popular party. It polls ahead of both the Tories and Labour in terms of that cohort, that kind of cohort of the population. So yeah, this absolutely entirely benefits the SNP. There is very little kind of downside, I think, as far as they're concerned.